Aloha, everyone. Welcome to our session. Is history repeating itself? And I've been for the last couple of years. I've been really grateful with this conference. We're always intentionally wanting to make sure our LGBT or our Mahu communities are included in the programming in one way or another. Because for me, as someone who is from the community, feels it's really important that we just keep continuing to intentionally raise up our voices um, of who we are and our place in the community. And so we'll get started. My name's Kunane Dreyer. I am the director of program and training here at Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center on Oahu. I use he, him, oya pronouns. I'm from Hau'ula. Born and raised in Hau'ula on Oahu. My father's Hawaiian, my mother's from New York. I look like I'm from New York, but I live in Hau'ula. It kind of looks like, and I say this because a lot of times when I talk about identity and I tell people I identify as Mahu, I share that when I'm in a space where people understand or have a little bit of an idea of what that identity is of being someone who says I'm Mahu. I was just in a conference last week on the continent in a room with all these people who look like me but weren't same background, but don't know what Mahu is. So I just said, I'm LGBT, right? So depending on the space I'm in, I use a different word. I explained to them really quickly what Mahu was, but I always talk about how when we talk about our Mahu community, we have to use Western words to describe and explain what Mahu is. And whenever we do that with any kind of Native Hawaiian cultural practice or just anything, right? Western words don't capture the full tone and the full meaning, the full essence of what we're trying to describe. But yes, so thank you all for coming today. The last 2 years, I did a LGB&T Mahu 101. This year, we're talking when I saw the theme, right? Sustaining justice and harmony, this journey of Malama Pono. It's like, oh, I can talk about, is history repeating itself? We're at a place in time right now where for many communities, whether it's LGBT&T, whether it's Mahu, whoever it may be, there's a lot of, is history repeating itself could be a good conversation just because of what we're seeing through politics and through other things that are happening, right? Especially on the continent. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about our journey as people, as a community, and a little bit of that history. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on right now. And then I want to also talk about today our resiliency as people, as a community, because that's so important, right? We didn't get this far to all of a sudden be pushed back in the closet or something like that. So yes, so mahalo everyone for being here. I am going to ask one last question. How many of you people know somebody who is Mahu or LGBT? Just raise your hand. I love to ask this question just so people can start to think about, and I always look for the person who doesn't raise their hand, just because I always ask, how do you know? Right? When it comes to our community, how do you know? Not everybody walks like me, talks like me, sachets into the room, and you can say, oh, right? That kind of thing, right? Not everybody carries themselves this way. And the person sitting next to you might be holding on to a part of their identity that they're not comfortable sharing with, and that just isn't put out on display the way I do. And so I always bring that up just to get people to think about, you just never know who's next to you, right? Or who your friend might be, right? That kind of thing, and some of this. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and we're going to jump into this. And it's a small group, which I like. So if there's anytime that you want to ask a question, just unmute and say "Hooey," or you could raise your hand. Jasmine is here. Jasmine is also monitoring for questions in the chat or something like that. But, and this is a safe space. You can ask me anything you want. You see me in long strugs over the weekend, maybe not so, not the right space, but here, anything you want, I'm happy to share. I am a lifetime member of this community. From day one in Hau'ula to now, I was part of this community. So I'm happy to share anything with you folks. Okay. So share. Here we are, right? Is history repeating itself in our resiliency story? And so I'm going to jump into this really quickly just to tell you a little bit of where I'm from. Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center. We're here in Kaka'ako on Oahu. We are the merged entity of the Life Foundation, which was Hawaii's oldest and largest AIDS service organization. And then the CHOW project, which is our statewide syringe exchange project. And we merged 6 years ago to form Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center. And we do a lot of work in communities, many communities that I like to say people don't understand or know how to. So it's easier to just say, no, we don't, versus me having, other thoughts about them. But we work in these communities, people with substance use, houselessness, people living with HIV and hepatitis, right? Transgender community or Mahu community, right? A lot of communities that people just don't understand. But and we do a lot of work here in Hawaii and then also in the Pacific. So that's been really nice. We are at the intersection of criminal justice, mental health, HIV and Hep C care and prevention, substance use and houselessness. And I say the intersection because what we've come to experience is somebody may come into our door because they're interested in a specific service. After you talk story with somebody, then we discover there's more going on to and with this person, and they might benefit from other services that we may have. Or how do we connect them to the appropriate place to malama them, right? How do we do that? And so that's why I say we're at the intersection of these services. We have about 27 different programs now here at our agency. Like we've really grown over these last 6 years to be able to support the community. Okay, I asked that question. Our objectives were in the thing. So this is me. So we're going to start off really quick with a little bit of data, just so that you know a little bit about who we are and what we're dealing with as LGBT and Mahu individuals, right? But discrimination and barriers to well-being. 1 in 3 LGBTQI plus adults report some kind of discrimination based off of their gender identity or sexual orientation, right? Again, in the same group, 50% report workplace discrimination. 3 in 10 report housing discrimination. And then 1 in 3, some kind of negative experience or form of mistreatment when interacting with mental health professionals, right? So here we are trying to maneuver the world and we're experiencing these things. Then when we talk about Mahu, there's no data. And I talk about this often because we don't collect the data in this area when we think about our Mahu community. So some additional data for sexual and gender minority youth in Hawaii. And I share this because this is one of the best studies that we get through the YRBS data that comes out. When we think about our LGBT youth in Hawaii, and what we know is a lot of these behaviors will carry into adulthood, right? Because of their experiences, right? 1 in 10 LGBT youth, 4,700 high school youth. So 1.5 times of Campbell High School identify as LGB. And we separate out the T because LGB, again, is sexual orientation, T is transgender, right? So here we have some data around the number of youth we have that identify as LGB. And then 1 in 20 students are questioning their sexuality, right? And what is this? Who am I as a person? Right? And then 1,000 high school youth reported on the day of the questionnaire of the study being identifying as transgender. So we're seeing more and more of our youth, of our community, our people starting to come out. We're seeing it's not a small number, and so it's how do we malama our youth now who are are living in this world, right? These identities, right? We know that bullying and violence is up, right? There's a greater risk for bullying as LGBT youth. 2 times more likely to skip school because they feel unsafe than their heterosexual youth partners, right? So we're seeing that it has an impact on day-to-day life. Transgender youth compared to their cisgender, 6 times more likely to attempt suicide, right? So we're seeing these higher rates. 1 in 2 LGBT youth having a have someone outside or do not have someone outside to actually speak to. So just some data, right? To put this in context as we talk about history currently, when we think about our people and our youth, our adults, there's some of these historical trauma, historical things that have been happening for a long time that are still continuing to happen in our world. Okay. So here's a little history, and I don't go into all of right. This is Kekoa, my colleague, was on earlier at a session talking about how colonization impacted Hawaii and everything, and I'm not going to go into that. But what I can share with you, and I wanted to highlight when it comes to colonization and our Western missionaries, have they come in, right? They changed our practices as people. They changed our belief systems. When you look at the binary, the gender binary, right? We had Kane, Wahine, and Mahu, but when you look at it from a Christian or a Western lens, it's male or female, right? Impacting on our people, our society as who we are, right? The Christianity and Ikane or our in this case, sexual minorities, or when we think about relationships and private, personal relationships, intimate relationships, Ikane, when you had same gender relationships, right? There was more kapu on who you could eat with versus who you slept with back in the day, right? Pre-Western contact. And so here we see Christianity come into our world and tell us that we are wrong and tell us we can't do certain things, right? So the impact of this on who we were as a people, starting way back, and when we were in a society living in our own and on our own. Another highlight for history here in Hawaii, and I like to say highlight because I've been able to sit with some of these girls, the women, ladies now, kupuna, they're actually kupuna now, here that were part of the Glade, right? When we think about our Glade, the bar, the club, the showroom that we had here down on Hotel Street. How many of you folks have heard of the Glades? Wave your hand if you've heard of the Glades. I see a hand coming up. So I was 16 when the Glades was around, and I remember being this young gay boy on the bus coming from Damien High School to down Hotel Street, right? And just wishing I could get into this place. The Glades was our kind of like our Stonewall, I want to compare it to, right? When we compare to Western LGBT history. The Glades was a showroom on Hotel Street, Hotel and River. And it's where all the ladies went. They hung out there. It was a safe place for them to be. It was live entertainment. There was no lip syncing. It was all live entertainment. It was, it was a place where they could come be who they were. The community could come and enjoy, right? And all of this. And then outside on Hotel Street in that whole 1 block radius is, Hotel Street back then was the red light district, our red light district. It was hustle and bustle, but it was also our red light district, right? The military men would come down to Hotel Street looking for some pleasure, some nice, conversation with the ladies, whether cisgender or our ladies that hung out at the Glades. And what happened they started getting in trouble. So when the military men got busted for being with a transgender or Mahu person, they would say, I didn't know. So then the military warned their people, don't go down there, don't do this, don't whatever. And some judge in his little bright mind, for whatever reason, said, well, let's make the girls wear this button that said, I'm a boy. So back in the early 90s, I mean the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the girls who were at the Glades were told to wear these buttons that said, I'm a boy. So we were already feeling these impacts of like, oh, you're not supposed to be, right? You're wrong, da 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 da. But the military men knew exactly what they were going down there looking for. They knew, they just didn't want to admit it. So our girls, this was our Stonewall. The girls started to push back. They said, no, we don't want to wear this button. They got creative, like they put the button on the inside of the purse. When the police came, they would flip the purse over, show that so the button could be seen. Because if they didn't have the button, they would get into a lot of trouble. Flip the button back over, right, when it's time, that kind of thing. But we have this long history of our own people here in Hawaii and us, how we're very resilient. And the city and county has done a whole project on the Glades. And if you go into the city and county website, I should get the website and put it up, but they have a whole history of the Glades that they put out a couple months ago. There's a plaque down there on Mauna Kea Street and Hotel that you can actually, there's a QR code that will take you to the link, but it's right there where the Glades stood. The Glades closed down in 1992, and then sometime after that, the building that it was in actually burned down. But Mauna Kea Marketplace is the spot of the Glades. So that's our own history here. And some of the things that we saw, the experiences that people were having on the continent. Okay. Any questions about that stuff now? Oh, and I encourage you, if you ever come across one of our kupuna that worked at the Glades or knew about the Glades, to sit and talk story. They have the most amazing stories to share about our history when we think about who we are as Mo'o. In the early 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they shared. Some of them are still around. And as they go, so do their stories. So we're trying to find how do we capture all of these stories. But if you ever have the opportunity to sit and talk with one of our kupuna, oh my goodness, then you'll be so intrigued by the stories. They're so much fun. Yeah. And if you talk about being resilient, right? Here we have our Auntie Brandy Lee, who's 82, right? Who was part of the Glades when it first opened, telling these stories, still around, these treasures, right? From our community that have just all this rich history to share and still here, and just the epitome of resiliency when we think about it. Yeah. And doing what we could call social justice back then when they were having to fight for their rights, kind of thing. So on the continent, let's move to the continent. For our LGBT community, I mentioned Stonewall. Stonewall was, how many of you folks have heard about Stonewall? Yeah, a couple. Stonewall was the start of the revolution for our LGBT people. Back in 1969 in June in New York City, and Stonewall is still there, the bar, but our community was tired of being harassed, being, they would get arrested, they would, all of this. And in June of 1969, after all these raids and everything that was happening, it is said, we don't know for sure, but a couple of our transgender women were done and over it, and they threw the brick into the bar, and so that started the riots in 1969. We like to say Pride. The first Pride was a riot, because ever since then, that's how come our Pride celebrations, parades, events are all in June. In most places is as a result of Stonewall, and that was the first pushback by our community to say we need to be respected. We don't want to be treated unfairly because of who we are, who we love, what we do, how we walk, right? And so our people, that was Stonewall in New York City, right? Which then led now to our Pride parades that have happened every year since. We have Harvey Milk, another leader in our community that was elected to the board. He was a civil servant, a human rights leader. He was in San Francisco, and he was the first openly gay board of supervisors in 1977. He also then was murdered, shot, right, and assassinated nearly a year after taking office. But he went in there pushing for and supporting and moving forward rights of the LGBT community. And he's a quote he said, right? It takes no compromise to give people their rights. Actually, it's not hard to treat someone with respect, right? It shouldn't be, right? Another big event in our LGBT history is the HIV epidemic when it came around, right? Came around and it hit the community hard. It scared the whole world, right? I mean, they were talking about we should lock the people up, put them on all these things that were coming about as the HIV epidemic was spreading, right? A lot of misinformation. Um, but in the early 1980s, the first cases, we're still here. We are 40, so 1980. We're 40 years into this, and there's still no cure. Some of the stigma and all the negativity around HIV has lessened, not gone, but lessened, right? And I will say that with COVID, when COVID came around, it brought up a lot of this, it stirred up a lot of the same feelings, the actions, the thoughts, the conversations, the comments that we were feeling and experiencing with the HIV epidemic, right? About like who's right, it's like lock them up, all this kind of stuff, right? The negativity. But there's still a lot of stigma attached to people when we think about HIV, whether you're living with HIV or not, right? If you are someone who might be more vulnerable to HIV, there's stigma around that because what are you doing? Those kinds of things. It still exists to this day. And then another key point in time was Matthew Shepard for our community, right? And he being a university student who was brutally attacked just because of who he was and left on the side of a fence to die. And that was a big thing for our community, right? And again, it tells us that we have to be concerned and worried about being our authentic selves in the world without, where we might have something could happen to us just because of who we are. So let's talk now. Is history repeating itself? When we think about, for many of us in our community, our LGBT community, we talk about, is history repeating itself? So I was told I can't say any names, but I think about here at home in Hawaii. I can tell you, I have, besides the early growing up in, where the word mahu was used very negatively, that kind of stuff, right? Like growing up in Hau'ula, when I heard mahu, and then I went to Kahuku school, right? It's like I hear the word mahu means I'm going to have to fight, right? It was used very negatively in the past, the word mahu. And so, but growing up here in Hawaii, I have to say, my life, I've been able to be who I am based on my family and my community. I was given the opportunity to still be who I was. Some places we didn't talk about it, but you could tell that kind of thing. But I was allowed to be who I was growing up. I think the challenges that I had were more amongst the peers and people who I didn't really know. Because in Hau'ula, you got to it didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter whose kid you were, right? We was community. Everybody took care of everybody. That kind of sense. It still is. I still live in Hau'ula. I still make 1 hour drive, right? I don't want to leave. But we've been here at home recently last year, right? A GOP lawmaker went to one of our schools. It was an intermediate school. And as he walked through the school, he saw some rainbows in the windows of people's offices. And then he spent a whole morning at this school. And the one thing he focused in on was the rainbow flags that were in someone's window. And it's like, is this what we want our kids to see? Right. And so we're seeing some of the rhetoric and things that are happening on the continent slowly flow into our state, right, into our home. And is that something we really want? And is that alone, does that make it an unsafe space for some of our youth, right? Does this make it unsafe for me now to walk down the street, right? What is the challenge in that area, right? And so there was a lot of hullabaloo around um, this situation here locally. I am happy to say that we still haven't seen as much of this here locally. Um, I still see though with our young Mohu that the families have sometimes a challenge with who they are, who their child may be, and their identity. And sometimes the families don't necessarily know how to support that, or and a lot of times maybe just against it. And so we see more and more of our youth out on the street, or things like that, because they don't have family support. So here in this moment, right, our LGBT people in America were under attack like never before, right? They want to erase LGBT people from public life, right? Don't say gay, that kind of thing, right? Banning medical care or legal recognition for someone for their true identity and who they are, that kind of thing, right? We want to enshrine inequality. And then the systemic and structural barriers for people to live their life to their true self. Um, and then silence the supporters, right? It's like, oh, if you say you're support something, it's like they come after you nowadays. So these are some of the things that we're seeing across the continent. So here's a little bit of information, right? Number of anti-LGBTQ bills introduced and passed in the last 3 years has just skyrocketed, right? So 725 plus bills in the last few years have been introduced. More than 100 of them have passed. And they all primarily relate to restroom sports, gender affirming care, things like that, right? About limiting who somebody can be as a person. Yeah. Again, we haven't seen a whole lot of it here, but I've heard conversations where people are like, well, you shouldn't be doing this and you shouldn't. And it's like, I don't know, I can't get into this argument with you kind of thing, right? It's sometimes, or is this the right person who I should be arguing with because they have the influence or space to make change or create the waves that are happening. But we're seeing a lot of this happen, right? Bills targeting transgender healthcare, and we hear about this, right? Even where, even with parental consent, or parents involved in their child's care, like people want it to. There's states that have made it illegal for youth, young adults, youth to have gender affirming care in any form, even with parental consent, right? And it's so hard to see some of this happening. And there's stories of parents and families that are moving states because they no longer have access to care. We have Florida, who's wanted to say, don't say gay or trans, that came out. That actually just kind of got repealed. There was something about it. It just happened in the last few weeks where I don't think it was repealed, but there's parts of it that were not legal and everything. So, there's a little part of me that wants to show up and my brother lives in Florida. So I always want to show up at his house and in his community and just sashay right through, right? And just stir up the pot. But I don't know if that's safe. But there's things like that, right? It's like, because some of this silliness, it's like, how do you not, it's like the erasure of our people, right? Can you see something like this happening here where it's like, don't say Mahu? When that's all part of our culture, our identity, our people, that would just be horrible. So I promise we're going to talk about some of the good stuff in resiliency. I'm just trying to give you a history, right? When we talk about banned books, and in these states that have these laws now that are in place, or where the protections have been taken away, we are seeing an increase in crimes against LGBTQ people. We're seeing an increase in crime and hate crimes, specifically, and things like that, as we've seen all of these, right? And even the banned books, like in states where there's banned books, we're seeing book bans, we're seeing things like this, where there's more um, hate and everything that's happening. And how do we get past some of that, right? Yeah. I saw somebody, a meme the other day on social media that said, I've read books all my life about heterosexual people and it didn't do a thing for me, right? That kind of thing. It's like trying to trying to disprove this science or the claims of, oh, if they read the book, they're going to become more cool. Not true. Not true. Right. And then this epidemic of violence that we've been seeing. And I say an epidemic of violence because over the last few years, our transgender women of color, we're seeing so many more instances of this happening with our transgender women of color, right? The hate attacks, more likely to experience physical violence when interacting with the police or other people, if they're a survivor of some of these attacks. But we're seeing this epidemic of transgender women being murdered across the country and across the world. You know, on November 20th of every year, we do Transgender Day of Remembrance, and we take time to stop to read the names of transgender women who have been murdered or in our country. And there's always more than 300 names that are provided to us to read, right, to honor. And then we also then look at into our own community, and we don't have a lot of the violence here to that extreme, but you know, we have many of our community who pass away. So we also take that event to honor them, because it's important that we do honor our who are transgender women that are from here, in that same sense. And but it's just happening, and people just kind of look the other way. So, you know, our community has been really hit lately with these negative interactions and these negative effects, and this whole thing about, are we going back in time? Are we going back in the day when we had to use code words, right? When we would ask them, that this was even before me, but though, you know, it's like, are you a friend of Dorothy? Right? Wizard of Oz, Dorothy, right? Judy Garland. That was the kind of code word for, you know, which meant, are you gay? Right? Things like that. Did we have to sneak? Right? We had to do all of these things. So, yeah. So I want to talk a little bit now about, or any questions or thoughts around this. How's that for you folks? Like, are you familiar with some of this that's been happening, or just the history?
Yeah,
I
I mean, I try to stay pretty up to date on what's going on, and I do a lot here on Maui to try and support our youth because I know how important it is to like have representation and have support and know that, you know, someone's gonna fight for you no matter what. And it's interesting sometimes to see the little ways people will lash out, right? To sort of sustain this idea of I'm different or, you know, whatever. Like for Pride this year, there was someone who like kept taking down the like Pride flag at our city hall, and they did it multiple times. And then we got it put back up. And it's just like it's such a minor thing. It's like, okay, so you don't want to see a flag. Well, it's there. Just get over it, you know? Yeah.
I'd like to add on that, Violet. Yeah, with the whole flag thing, there are personal people that I know, I go to the same gym with them that were taking down the flag, and it hurts, you know, and I had to express to them. I gave them my opinion about it and, you know, agree to disagree and whatnot, but um they were linking it to, I guess there's new colors on the flag, and their justification was that it represents pedophilia now. So I don't know, they're just all that little hate and stuff. It I don't think they even realize like how much it actually hurts. so many people, and especially for the youth that may be questioning or going through these types of things, it just shows that we're not accepted or they're not accepted.
Yeah. And you kind of bring up made me think, it's like, really, are we creating a space where people can feel comfortable? Are we creating a space that empowers people to be who they are? Are we creating that space for in the community? And then those who are not LGBT or Mahu, are we creating, or is, I shouldn't, because I am Mahu. Are we being an ally? Are we going to, am I going to stick up, right, Geisha? Like, am I going to share my thoughts and then say, oh, that's wrong, right? When someone who's from the community is not in the room, right? Because that's the big piece. It's like, what happens when we're not in the room? Because, and even some of these little microaggressions can be just as hurtful to, especially our youth, right? I'm 58, honey. I've heard it all already. It's like, you can't say anything to me that's gonna, at this point in life, but that wasn't always the case, right? And so how do we do that for our people, right? How do we not let history repeat itself, kind of thing? It's a good way to read it. But yeah, how do we malama our youth, especially our youth, to be who they are, right? All right, so the next section is, I call it, we will rise, right? We will rise as a people, we will rise as a community, we will rise. I was like, we have to now take, it's like, yes, all these things are happening, but how do we malama ourselves? How do we malama our community? How do we advocate? How do we stand up? How do we do some of these things to make sure that we don't lose our place? So I have to share my experiences over the last few years, and especially after everything that was going on at the Mauna, right? We had our whole uprising around the Mauna and what was happening up there. And the day that all that actually went down, we had our Kane on one side, and they were all, in their space. Wahine were up there, and our Kupuna were right there on the front line. And somebody asked, where's the Mahu? We need our Mahu up here. Somebody made one phone call from up there on the Mauna to Hina Lemoana Wong, who's a good friend of mine. But so then Hina made one call to Kathy Kapua. And next thing you know, there were 13 of us in our conference room the next day to talk about what is our role, what is our responsibility, right? What is our kulana, what is our kuleana in this situation? And what are we supposed to do? And after these conversations, a couple weeks later, we were up on the Mauna with them doing what we needed to do, right? Standing in solidarity with everyone else. And we started to become part of the conversations of like, what's next? What happens next? Then they had the big march that happened here in Honolulu that went from Ala Moana Beach Park, right? The 20,000 people that marched down Kalakaua Avenue to Kapiolani Park. Who was in the front? Was the Mahu, right? Leading this procession down Kalakaua Avenue. And my experience ever since then is I really started to see how we as a people, are being invited to the table more, to be an active participant in the conversations in the community, active participants in conversation around social justice issues, right? Seen in the light of the value of who Mahu were from from the beginning of time, right? From pre-Western. Like, that's for me what I'm really starting to feel and see, the respect of how people see our community. I still question or wonder sometimes, right, when we think about this world we live in being part Western, part Native Hawaiian, right, for people who, or Pacific Islander, whatever their identity may be, their heritage. But how do we live in these two worlds, right? How do I pick and choose which values that I want to embrace, right? when I think, because I always hear, and I have people in my own community in Hau'ula that were there at the same gender marriage bill, right? From Hau'ula, Native Hawaiian, da da da, you know, all supportive, love me. We even crossed paths at the whole rally, hug, kiss, everything. But because of their Western or religious beliefs, we're very anti, like this shouldn't happen, right? So how do we live in this world where we have these two different backgrounds that kind of come together and merge, right? When we think we have, I'm Native Hawaiians, these are the values that I live by and I practice. But then I also have a history or a background in whatever, whether it's in Western world, right? This Western realm. And how do we live in these two places? How do we find harmony to embrace both, right? How do I find harmony to say, yes, I love my Mahu people that are, you know, all of this, but yet with this strong religious background, it doesn't line up, right? Sometimes that can be, I find that interesting, and I sometimes will ask and have a conversation with people just because I'm so interested. My brother is one of the very ones. Kamehameha alumni, right? All of this, lives in Florida, loves to say I'm Hawaiian, I'm Hawaiian, I'm Hawaiian. I do all of these things Hawaiian, but has very westernized and religious background and values. And so, and then I keep thinking, I'm your brother, your Mohu brother. You're supposed to just embrace us, but it doesn't always line up, right? How do we find this place to live in this space with both worlds? So I always ask that, but I have to say my experiences over the last 6, 7 years since this all happened is that I see more and more people looking at Mahu um, in a different light, right? With a little more respect, that they have a little deeper understanding of who we are, right? The caretakers, the teachers, the practitioners in the community, in the family, right? And our role and responsibility and that importance. Because Hina always talks about this. If you know everybody, it didn't matter who you were, Mahu, Kane, Wahine, when you know your role, you know your responsibilities. It has nothing to do with anything else. And also being Mahu has nothing to do with who I want to sleep with, right? And this is where I talk about how when we try to explain Mahu using Western words, it often gets linked to someone who's transgender or a very feminine boy, right? Those are kind of the definitions that people will link Mahu to, but that's not who Mahu are, right? So we're seeing though more of us having a place in community, place in society, a place in our families with a little bit more respect that's been attached to that, right? Resiliency, right? Research has shown us that older LGBT adults show signs of resilience despite facing all these inequalities, all the negativity, um, right? And impact on their health and social well-being. And we see, and what we know with our community, right, is yes, there's been the struggle. There's been all of these things that we've had to live through, but that sometimes makes us stronger as a people, right? So we have some of these resiliencies built in. We also, as a community, came together over all these years because we knew that sometimes for some of us, that's all we had, right? So when we talk about family or ohana, our family, our chosen family, looks different, right? Then, and in fact, just 2 weeks ago at another conference, I heard someone talk about our Native Hawaiian families don't necessarily look like and mirror the nuclear family when you think of what in Western definitions, right? Our ohana, our family, looks different for us in Hawaii. And so it's so important that we find that community. We've been able to, how many of you folks have heard of the show Pose? So back in the 80s, when the HIV epidemic and all of that, we had to, our community, our people, as they were being disowned and found to be, with nowhere to go, we started to form these houses. And these houses, and this started off in New York and everything, but these houses became the place where people could find refuge. They found the support, they found family, right? These houses, and then there were a lot of them were named, like there's here locally, there's House of Ashton, Chandelier, Del Rey. These houses were set up to provide us that sense of home and family, and were set up the same way any other nuclear or any other family, right? There's the matriarch, right? So Maddie, who works here with me, Madeline Ashton, she's the matriarch of the Ashton house. She has 13 kids of her own, right? And these are kids that youth and that she took in to give a safe place to sleep, to stay. She provided that parental and some of them aren't that much younger, but she provided the guidance of what it meant to transition, how to look for a job as you're transitioning, right? How to go back to school, things like that. And so she had these 13 kids, and then these 13 kids all have kids. So, it's the same kind of family tree setup, same family support that was being provided, but just not in the traditional sense, right? We were very resilient to create these spaces for our people, our community. And they're still in existence because we still see youth being put out of their families and not know have nowhere to go. So they get what they call their drag mom or drag dad or something. So, if you're in this field working and someone says, I'm bringing my mom or I'm bringing my dad, and Maddie shows up or somebody, we know biologically that's not the parent, right, or the support system, but we do know that that person is filling in and providing that same support for them, right? The resiliency of how we find family, our chosen family within our community is amazing, right? And then on top of it, here in Hawaii, right, everybody, we always take care of our people, right? We always take care. And so it's that same concept of ohana, of family, and how we do this, right? How we hanai our keiki, right? How we take into and we take in people into our families. It's that same concept for us. So very resilient. Right, so we had our Hawaii marriage equality passed. A few of these people in this picture are my friends, but they married, I think it was 6 couples after the law passed. This was on December 1st when the law took effect at midnight. They had their ceremony, and these are the couples that were the first to get married in Hawaii. Same gender couples that were able to then get married and celebrate the same love, the same everything that all married couples get to have, right? So that passed. That took a long time, right? And again, there were people from they were busing the people in from BYU Laie. That was the everybody, and they bust the people in to come to the state capitol to, for the people who were against it. It was quite an interesting, how do we advocate, right? And how do we take this? Well, it's quite interesting, but this is another beautiful thing that has happened here. Okay. Here in Hawaii, things that are also, right, our LGBT protections in Hawaii, right? Governor Ige, he did some good things for our community, right? To be more inclusive, right? So a few things that happen. Health insurance companies cannot discriminate against transgender people seeking gender affirming care. And what this did was, if you were biologically male, with your health insurance, you were only allowed certain procedures, right? That were linked to your biological sex that you were born, and vice versa if you were female. And so getting gender affirming care wasn't covered, and you had to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get for this to happen. And so they passed this law about 5 years ago, I think it was now. When was this? 2020, yeah. We're coming up on 4 years, a little over 4 years. Now health insurance companies cannot discriminate against care. So the minute this passed, our community, our transgender community, were able to go to their providers and start to receive gender affirming care, because we know through research and just we know, because when we can align our bodies to match who we are, life is a little easier to maneuver. Life is a little more enjoyable to live, right? And so gender affirming care now all of a sudden became accessible to thousands of people who couldn't get it before, right? Whether that's just someone who might want hormone therapy or someone who would whose journey is to get them to have a sex reassignment surgery, right? So whatever your journey is for this person, now it's covered by health insurance. We didn't have that before. It was a struggle, right? You can't be discriminated for jury duty, and there's LGBT people in Hawaii, the commission. We're excited about that. They have a whole little commission on how to really just kind of keep us. How do we have this conversation about who we are? Right? How do we lift the voices, just even if it's just to keep us in the forefront? And as a result of that, the city and county has a now someone who is the LGBTQ plus liaison. And what I love about this is he's not from our community. So he's a big ally person who's there at the community, city and county level, making sure things are happening. And if you are on Oahu, October 1st at 1 o'clock, they're going to have the raising of the flag. So Oahu celebrates Pride in October. And so they're going to have the raising of the pride flag at the city council at Honolulu Hale Tuesday at 1 o'clock. So if you're around, you can go see that. And hopefully, Violet, no one will be coming to take down our flag. Yeah, not sure how yeah. So hopefully, right, we won't have to deal with that, right? Then, we have a long history of mistrust and negative experience with the police, right? As LGBT people, especially our transgender, as our Mahu community, when we think about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, there's these horrific stories that we know of, right? Where somebody's called the police because there's domestic violence happening or intimate partner violence happening, and the police come and show up and they're like, well, why are you letting him, referring to the partner who's Mahu as a boy, as a man, and why are you calling, right? You should be duking this out on your own. Just negative experiences from interactions with the police historically. Now, there's two LGBTQ liaisons with the Honolulu Police Department. We're doing trainings with the police department of just cultural humility, right? And when we talk about cultural humility, it's really just like a little bit more of an understanding of who the community is, so that you have a little more insight into how we interact with people, right? And so this is really exciting. I actually get to go once a quarter to the police department and do a little LGBT cultural humility with them, and things like that. And so we're seeing efforts being made. And here's the thing, like, we don't want special treatment and we don't need all these exceptions. We just want to be safe. We just want to be treated with respect. Okay. So here, what can you do when it comes to malamaing our people, right? How do we do this, right? And it's right along like how Deja was speaking about. It's like utilizing our experience, expertise, our personal experiences as how we talk about the community to change hearts and minds about who we are, right? How do we change the negativity that people are sharing or speaking of out there in the world, the misconceptions of who we are as LGBT or Mahu people, right? Creating space of affirming spaces, safe spaces for our people when they come in to see you, or even when you're sitting in Starbucks, right? How we know when it's like, oh yeah, we can go sit down next to Adele, because Adele's gonna be, we could feel the energy, right? We could feel that, and it's like, how do we create that so that I see Adele at Starbucks and I get to sit down and we just get to kiki, right? Talk story or whatever, right? How do we create that? How do I let people know I'm an ally also, and say what I need to say when it needs to be said, right? Continuing to educate ourselves around LGBT issues, Mahu issues, right? Things like our Mahu community. And when I talk about our Mahu community, it's really more, how do we become more knowledgeable of who our Mahu community is and their role and the responsibilities that they play in the world, right? And not getting stuck on how when we have to talk about the Western labels of being LGBT or being transgender and not equating those together, right? How do we really talk about the context of who are in our lives, right? In our place, right? So continuing to educate ourselves and things like that around all of these issues. And then join our fight. Sometimes we still have to fight, right? But we're resilient people. And for those of us who have walked through things and are in this place where it's easier to latch on and embrace the resiliency of who we are as a people. How do we share that then with those who might still be trying to figure out how to get to that place? Right? When we think about, especially with our youth, right? When we're still trying to figure out who we even are, and everybody else is trying to tell us who we're supposed to be, right? How do we be that little light, right? How do we malama our people? How do we do social justice? How do we do all of these things to take care of our community? So yeah, so that's things that we could do in our world, in our community. And I created my PowerPoint to leave some space for questions or talk story or things like that. So we still have a few minutes, or are we almost done? Because I know the closing session is at 2:30, correct? Which is right after this. And I saw I think our closing speaker is here in the room too. I love it. But yeah, so I don't know, any thoughts, questions? Things that come to mind, things that maybe you do to lift up the social justice, the resiliency of our Mahu or LGBT community, or even for yourselves. Okay, I see Adele, your hand up.
Thank you, Konane. My question is more on a personal level. I have a niece who is a lesbian, and when she came out to the family, she came out by bringing home um, her girlfriend. And I still have family members that are up to this day, after so many years, are still in shock and also judging my niece and using religion to judge her by saying, this is a sin of God, what you're doing. Why are you in a relationship with a person that is same sex as you? And I've tried several times to help educate them. But because I am younger than them, then my knowledge, my authority doesn't count. What suggestions do you have to help our family members to embrace the LGBTQ?
You know, you bring up some interesting points, and then Samantha, I saw your question in the chat, so we'll get to that too. But you bring up a few good things. So sometimes, right, especially with our elders, our kupuna, our elders in our family, sometimes they're just, I like to say, sometimes if they're set in their ways, it's almost easier for us so maybe your niece to just continue to be herself and do what she's going to do in hopes that at some point others will come around to embrace her for who she is and her partner. And that and even, we as the individual who's in the situation. So we also need to understand that even though we've busted out of the closet, right? We bursted out of the closet, we've come home with our girlfriend, that not everybody is going to be able to transition to be all of what we want them to be just like this. So sometimes it's just really, sometimes it can be a slow process. To this day, up to my mother passing away, she never referred to my boyfriend as my boyfriend. She always said that was my friend. He was in the house a lot, all of that kind of thing. And that was okay. And I knew that's just the way she was going to be. But she came around slowly to the idea of, she knew, but we didn't talk about it. So same thing with your, especially since they're elders, right, of yours. Sometimes we just have to fit into that space and let them slowly come around. But the more that we show them how wonderful the relationship is, how wonderful we are as individuals still are, then they slowly come around. And we just have to let that process organically happen. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
We can't change everybody, kind of thing, right? And then sometimes if we force things, it makes the situation worse. So even we have responsibility on our end to slowly, right, malama the situation so that we can move it forward. Okay, the question in the chat, can you speak a little on how local culture, hypermasculinity, impacts local youth and how we remain culturally aware with families while also attending to LGBT youth? So Samantha, just so I understand, are you talking, where's Samantha? There she is, you're right in my middle of the screen. Are you talking about like these historical or kind of these gender roles of masculine and feminine and how they've historically always had this we're supposed to live up to this certain idea of what they mean in places, in families?
Yeah, I think just in just growing up here and everything, I think that you know there are parts of local culture that can be a little bit more closed-minded, that involve things like families kind of encouraging hyper masculine ideals and values and things like that onto their children. And so I'm just wondering how you would recommend like attending to and caring for the LGBTQ plus youth and families, while also being sensitive to and like empathetic of culture with families.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are, and Samantha, thank you for the question. There is a lot of this, like, oh, you're a boy, you're supposed to do A, B, C, D, right? These expectations of masculinity or expectations of femininity and the roles and what people do and how we're supposed to act and whatever, right? That we are brought up in families. And then sometimes there's a little bit of a struggle of like, how do we sometimes not impose that? And my personal experience, so here's why I have a story of a good friend of mine. His son in the 10th grade came out and said, I want to be a girl, I'm supposed to be a girl, right? He said, and in his head he's like, what do I do? How do I be supportive to my son telling me this story? How do I cover and then a lot of it sometimes is that the external factors, right? It's like, Kunani, what about my friends? They're going to tell me, about my son being Bahu and stuff like that, right? These external forces that are coming in that guide people into sometimes the wrong direction, right? We do things because we're worried about what somebody else is going to say. The beautiful thing with this story is after talking with him, I finally asked, I said, well, what do you want from your son? What do you want from your child? And he said, I want my child, I want him, and at that time he said, I want him to graduate from high school. Because he said, even if he's transgender or Mahu or whatever, without a high school diploma, life would really be even more challenging. So his goal was, how do I get my child to graduate from high school? And then we were able to have a conversation about, well, and what are you feeling and thinking about this whole situation where your son is saying he wants to be a girl? He said, well, I don't know what to do with any of that, because he comes from this macho type family, right? Big Hawaiian family. The boys were the macho ones, the girls, these very traditional roles of masculine and feminine. And also a Catholic background. And so there was all of this swirling around in this conversation. And it took a little while, but at some point he said, I just want my child to be happy. And I don't know what it was that turned that light switch on. And so, my friend and the wife were divorced, so they were, and everything like that. And what ended up happening was my friend, after all, he tried to figure out became the champion for his kid. So he started to learn, what does this mean to transition? What does this mean for all of this to happen? He had to go to bat in the family to stick up for the son, because he started to transition at that time a little bit, and all of this thing. And it today, beautiful young girl, went to college, everything, and transitioned. It's not the story that we hear a lot of the times, but there was a big bumpy part. And so it was just that one piece where the question of, what do you want for your son? Right? What do you want for your child? And then you can kind of focus it on that. And then that opened the door to have more conversations around what this meant to transition for that child. But it's like, how do you do that? Because a lot of times families are stuck in this mode of, oh, boy, girl, right? These two identities, masculine, feminine action, things like that. And so if you're working with a family who might have somebody who's LGBT or Mahu youth child, when working with the parents, it's like, the more important question to me is, what do you want for your kid, right? Do you want for your child? And then how do you support that? And trying to get them away from a little bit away, just enough time away from the topic of being LGBT and or transgender or Mahu, right? It's like, how do we have a conversation where we can maybe pull that out just enough so that we can focus on how do we move forward? But yes, there's a lot of that, and masculinity, the whole femininity, and what we're supposed to be. And parents, and I guess I think about this now only because you brought it up, but it's like, I wonder what my father said when, because I was that loud feminine boy from the get-go. And now that you bring it, I'm wondering, it's like, I wonder what my father said to his friends about me, right? Growing up and stuff like that. Because my father was this big Hawaiian guy, fisherman, everything, right? And it's like, here comes the little Mahu into the room. And I never really thought about that, And then when you're a kid, you don't think about those kinds of things, right? You're thinking that your family's going to just be there for you. There was no negativity, but now I wonder what he said, because sometimes these outside influences can really have an impact on how we want to raise our kids. Sometimes it's not always about, so how do we just get them to think about what's best? What do you want for your kid? And then what does your kid want? What does a child want? And how do we support that? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any last thoughts? I just got the message. We're getting ready because we're going to move into the closing session. But thoughts, anything? If you see me in Longs, say, "Hooey." You can pull me outside of Longs and ask me questions. That's fine. But check who's around. All righty. Well, thank you all for spending the time with us this afternoon, especially right after lunch. Yes. So mahalo, mahalo, mahalo.
Hello.
Mahalo.
Okay. Aloha.